voters. Vicky?
Thanks, Sam. And you know, in Crispin's defense, today really is an extension of yesterday. You can call it Voting Day 2.0. And we know that a few polling stations are still going to go to the ballot today due to hitches that were experienced yesterday, August 9th, voting day. But let me introduce my guest really quickly. We have Muthiora Kariara, who's joining us, youth activist, party leader, as well as former presidential running mate. How are you?
I'm good, Victoria. I'm actually elated that D-Day came.
Yeah.
And Kenya is still a going concern. People are hopeful that the peace we've seen so far is going to continue to prevail. And gladly, the results that people thought would take too long to arrive are more than just trickling in. At the presidential level, they actually are flooding the space. It's just that maybe the decoding of the forms is what will take us longer. But Kenyans are glad, I'm sure, and happy that there is so much information that's already at the tallying center.
No, absolutely. Those numbers coming in really quickly. And by numbers, I mean the Forms 34A. So far, 86.07% of them have come through to the Bomas of Kenya, the National Tallying Center, at least for the presidential race. And if you want to have an eye of those numbers yourself, you can head over to the IEBC website where all the counties are accounted for. You have the percentage of the forms that have come in by county, by constituency, by polling station. It gets that granular. And you can also download that form for yourself and do the tabulation if you want to keep yourself busy through these night hours. But, you know, let's come to the issue of voter turnout. A bit shocking when you think about by 4 p.m., the IEBC reported slightly over 12 million registered voters had turned up. This was out of the 22.1 million registered voters in this election cycle. That's 10 million registered voters by 4 p.m. who didn't turn up.
Yeah.
That's huge. I mean, what do you make of that?
The telltale signs were there. You remember IEBC conducted the enhanced mass voter registration exercise twice, and each time they missed the target. There's a point when they were talking about registering 8 million voters, but then that number was missed by a lot.
Right.
So that was the first sign. And then look at the huge number of aspirants who gave themselves for this election. That was another sign yet that we need a change. But then looking at how they were processed and how many of them were locked out of the eventual race, of course, there was going to be backlash in the sense that people would not be so enthusiastic. So you look at the promises that have been made to the people by leaders when they came to get their vote,
Right.
and you realize that it has been lies after lies. And in 2013, when very rosy manifestos were launched, there is a generation that was watching. People who were promised laptops or their brothers and sisters, and they did not see those laptops as had been promised. And then they've grown up, they've obtained IDs, they've become voters, and they're seeing the same people who made those promises. So I would say there's a sense of loss of belief that elections can actually have an impact in the lives of ordinary Kenyans.
I mean, so broken promises is creating or breeding this disillusioned electorate. And, you know, I'm just pulling up on that magic wall, what 2013 looked like in terms of the voter turnout, and that was 85.69%. You know, Sam, when you look at 2013 compared to now, the turnout way better than what we're dealing with, over 12 million votes cast at that time. You know, when you look at that comparison, Sam, just take us through those numbers really quickly, and I want to get to Muthiora's reaction.
Okay, all right. Remember that in 2013, the voter register had about 14.3 million, registered voters. It was a very competitive election and the very first one since the passage of the new constitution. So the votes that were cast were 12.3 million. The turnout was 85%. So 12.3 million would appear to be almost the same figure as the turnout that was reported by IEBC yesterday as of 4 p.m. Of course, there are several areas that had not concluded voting. There are several counties and several polling stations that still had very long queues for them to take part in that election. So that may go up slightly, but it may not hit the voter turnout of 77.6% that was in 2017. So if you compare those 2 years, 2013, voter turnout of 85.69%, it went down by almost that should be about 9 percentage points, or maybe 8 percentage points to settle at 77.64%. But then again, in that election, if you had to look at some regions, for instance, Nairobi, the voter turnout was at 72.6%. The registered voters are 2.25. Of course, right now, the voter register has got more names at 2.41. If you had to look at Kiambu that time, the registered voters are 1.18 million in Kiambu. The turnout was 83.7%. So the question is, what percentage of voter turnout will it be this time round in Kiambu? Of course, 1.275 million are the registered voters. If you compare that with the turnout so far, it's 2.29%. Of course, very few polling stations that have so far been tallied. Actually, 4,626 out of the total of the country, which is about, is it 1% or is it 10%? Yeah, it looks like 10% of the polling stations have so far been tallied. And specifically with Kiambu, we'll be looking at that as it is. Vicky.
You know, I wonder, Muthiora, when you look at those numbers just in comparison, the last 2 election cycles, 2013, roughly 85%, 2017, 77%. I mean, there's been this gradual decline in terms of voter turnout. So you could say, well, there's a pattern there. That's why we're seeing it. But what informs it? Because I remember listening to the earlier panel with Yvonne Okwara, where one of the panelists said, look, when you look at the rally turnout, that doesn't always necessarily translate to votes, you know, and so what is informing this civic disengagement, if you will, where on the campaign trail, the numbers speak, but not at the ballot?
Well, we could actually take it a bit behind to 2002, when after the 2002 general election, Kenya was voted as the most optimistic country in the world. Back then, you remember, on our wish list, we had items such as constitutional amendments. We had the hope that our government would shift from the central government into a form of governance that is closer to the people. So I would term these as we've had a gradual decline in the aspirations of the people as to how much value they can derive from governance. Back then, they believed that their engagement could change their lives. But then, as some of the things they aspired to got delivered and their lives did not change significantly, they have sort of disengaged. And I believe Kenyans feel like we need a radical shift in the way that we approach things, and not necessarily that when we elect leaders, they are going to do that which will move us forward. So we are reaching a stage of plateauing in terms of our aspirations as to what we can derive out of our leadership structure. You look at the region we live in, talk about a country such as Malawi, talk about Zambia. You look at their new voter registration numbers and you realize that their numbers have been rising when Kenya's numbers have been declining. Why is that so? It's because in those countries, they've not arrived where we already have arrived. They still believe that if we amend our constitution, if we change the leadership we have, then perhaps we will eradicate poverty, will be a better place to tackle disease and all these other things that plague them. But then we've had a chance at fixing those things, and the leadership that we voted in did not make it happen for Kenyans. So it's that point where, for human beings, we say we've reached a sense of self-actualization, but now in a governance sense, but realizing that our change or shift is not going to come from voting in new leaders. Maybe there's another way, which could be reforming our education, just a suggestion, or other things, maybe socially, but politically, we are reaching a plateau.
Interesting. You know, I wonder what role the trust factor plays in the electoral process, and just playing with the idea that most Kenyan voters have that, look, most of our elections are predetermined. They kind of, approach the ballot that way. How does a body like the IEBC that is tasked with delivering a free, fair, and credible election boost that trust in the voter ahead of elections, or even in that 5-year period in between the election cycles? How do they do that?
I think by being honest.
Yeah.
For a very long time, we've ran the narrative that IEBC is an independent body. It's not, but they're not ready to admit it. For their budget and operations, they rely on other arms of government, and we've seen twisting in the process. We've seen them receive funds much later. We've seen their budgets get slashed. So the first conversation they need to engage with should be with Kenyans, and that's with regard to how this whole thing was set up and that it's not actually working. We have advanced in the fact that Kenya has finally gotten to a point where we have operationalized the judiciary fund. And there is that kind of a setup where IEBC is supposed to get a fund such as that, so it does not rely on Parliament to pass its budget. So what IEBC needs is, after this election, which we hope will not be bungled further because there has been a bit of that, they will now engage the people. They will be bold and basically admit that it hasn't worked. Maybe we need to reform the way that the body is set up. Now, of course, that will rely on the kind of parliamentarians we are going to vote in, because ultimately it's going to be Parliament that makes whatever legal changes that need to happen. You talked about trust, and yes, we have a huge trust deficit amongst Kenyans and for the institutions that run things here. And it's been because since independence, promises were made and we had opportunities to do better, but then people chose to sacrifice common good for self-aggrandizement. That will not be cured through a magical pill. It's going to take time, but I believe focus should not be more on individuals. Our Constitution has given us a chance to build strong institutions. But then the way it's been set up, you realize that for most of the institutions, ultimately it's the president that okays the appointments that matter. So after this election, it's good we had begun a conversation about amending the Constitution. Perhaps we should follow the guidelines that were set, that if those who are pushing BBI would go about it following the right procedure, then it would be okay. It's time to revisit that conversation. And then we can cure these institutions so they serve the purpose for which they were set up.
Okay, fantastic. We'll come back to this conversation, but let's cross over now to Wahiga Muthiora. Speaking to some of the diaspora voters, we know 12 countries voted for the presidential seat yesterday, and we want to get some of their reactions. Wahiga?
All right, Vicky, and before I get to that,